Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and this is the 7th week of the course. In this week, we are trying to sort of revise whatever processes with respect to language that we have already read about, and what we are trying to add to that is we are trying to add the neural basis of each of these functions. So that is basically what I have been doing in the last 3 lectures of the week, and today I will take that further with talking a little bit more about language comprehension and production. Let us move ahead. Now, one of the models of language or organization of language in the human brain was given by Peter Hagoot, and basically this model, what it does is it divides this language processing system, the entire system of producing speech or comprehending speech and whatever is involved in, say for example, in negotiating different aspects of speech. The model kind of divides all of this into 3 functional components. It says that memory is used, integration is needed, and a sort of control is used. So, we are mostly going to talk about language comprehension with respect to this model, and it says there are 3 processes. The first process is memory, and memory is basically involved in the storage and retrieval of items from the mental lexicon. Now, one of the earlier lectures in this week we talked about mental lexicon, and we talked about the fact that the mental lexicon contains all the information about the words that is to be stored, and this information is a variety of things. It is a syntactic information, semantic information, kind of word, that is what kind of argument, say for example if it is a verb, what kind of argument it comes with, so on and so forth. So that information needs to be stored and retrieved again and again if you are to, say for example, either comprehend a particular word or produce a particular word, and you will need that information in order to make the correct utterance. The second sort of information, or the second process, major process in this model, is the process of unification. And the process of unification basically is there if you are trying to comprehend something. You would need to integrate a variety of sources of information. You would need to integrate lexically retrieved phonological, semantic and syntactic information, and then on the basis of a combination of these 3 factors form an overall representation of the whole utterance. So, if you remember in the last lecture I was talking about how context is really very necessary in order to understand the whole word, and with the word you need, say for example, the phonological form or the visual form. Also then you need, say for example, the lexical access part is there, wherein you will get the semantic and syntactic information. Even further than that, you actually go and need to integrate the word into the whole sentence or into the whole conversation. So all of those unification processes are given a special importance in this particular model. And the model kind of says that language comprehension basically is achieved by all of these processes functioning in parallel and together achieving or together converging to a particular result. Then the final process that this model talks about is the process of control, and the process of control basically says that this is something that is used in daily conversation. Say for example, if you are having a conversation with somebody, you would speak something, will wait for them to listen and react to that, and you will again speak something, and the other person will speak something. So that kind of turn taking. Or suppose if you are a bilingual on the basis of, and you know 2 languages fairly well and you are comfortable with both the languages, you still would use one particular language to talk to one specific kind of person. So for example, you would have in your life people who you would only converse in your L1, which is your native language. Say for example, in my case that is Hindi. So I have certain people with whom I will only conversate in Hindi, and then I also have certain people who I would only conversate, say for example people from work, I will mostly conversate with them only in English. So all of these kind of control processes, say for example production part and also comprehension, because this model is mostly about comprehension. So maybe if you have to stick to that, understanding, say for example, what each of the language symbols actually mean and what is the overall conceptual idea. So all of this control part is basically done by this component of control. So this model has memory, unification and control. Now let us look at it a little bit more closely in terms of the brain. Here on the right you can see this particular figure, or from Gazzaniga, you will see that the memory areas are mainly in the temporal lobe, which is basically the areas in the yellow, and then there is the unification areas are in light blue, and then the control areas are slightly further up in the frontal lobe, which are in purple. So these are the 3 areas which are, as per Peter Hagoot, carrying out this entire processing of language with respect to memory, storing and retrieving information, unification, integrating multiple sources of information to arrive at correct representations, and control. So all of this is happening. Now, as shown here, as I already said, the temporal lobes are especially important for the storage and retrieval of word representations. Phonological and phonetic properties of words are stored in the central to posterior superior temporal gyrus, including the vernix area. So the areas in the yellow. It extends into the superior temporal sulcus on the top, and semantic information basically is found distributed over the different parts of the left, middle, and the inferior temporal gyrus. So this broad huge region is the one that kind of is doing the storage part. The processes basically that combine and integrate phonological, lexical, semantic, and syntactic information are known to engage the frontal area. So they are above this particular sulcus, which sort of also extends a little bit into the Broca's area or the left inferior frontal gyrus. So that is basically the area in light blue here. Now, this left inferior frontal gyrus basically has been proposed to be involved in at least 3 kinds of unification processes that are needed. The semantic unification is done in areas BA47 and BA45. This is basically BA basically refers to Brodmann's nomenclature. So you can, if you pick up a brain atlas at some point in time, you will basically find this is a scheme of nomenclature which Paul Broca established. So BA basically means Brodmann's area 47 and 45. Syntactic unification happens in Brodmann's area 45 and 44. 44 is Broca's area. And phonological unification happens in areas 44, 45 and 46, 44 and 46, which are basically also, by the way, covered in this light blue zone right here. Now, the control component of the model, the one in purple here, is basically something that is most relevant to when people are actually engaging in conversations, as I was saying, and also aspects of cognitive control for bilinguals and multilinguals. We will talk about that in the next week when you are talking about bilingualism in more detail. Now, these areas are proposed to be involved more specifically are areas in the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So these are again the areas which are already covered in the purple zone. So this is again, this was just one model of how comprehension or language processing might be happening, and Peter Hagood kind of breaks these down into 3 major 3 major parts into how language comprehension is done. And this is how we saw that, okay, these are the areas which might be that language comprehension circuit. Now, moving further, we have seen that language per se or most of these functions that we have been talking about per se are mostly situated in the left hemisphere. So recent research basically and also say for example research from Paul Broca's time has looked into the structural and functional connectivity of the areas of the brain that are involved in language. And basically the research has identified several interconnected networks. So it's not like just one area. So it's not more like the localizationist or connectionist theme. It's more like this entire there are these so many areas which are all interconnected to each other, and this entire network sort of achieves the task of language production and comprehension. Okay, and these networks basically store word representations from the temporal lobes, and the integration areas are in the frontal lobes. So all of these areas that what we are talking about. Now, for spoken language comprehension, Angela Friederici basically has elaborated a network of language pathways. So that this is the network that kind of helps us in understanding spoken language. Let us look at that. Here is in this model on the right side, you can see that there are these particular areas. Here you can see Brodmann's areas slightly more clearly labeled. So you have BA 45, 47, you have BA 44, you have premotor cortex as in PMC, you have the inferior, you have the IPC, which is your inferior parietal cortex, you have posterior superior temporal gyrus, superior temporal sulcus, you have the primary auditory cortices, you have anterior superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus. So all of these areas are here, and by arrows you can see that they are connected to these particular pathways. Now, in this model, the model that has been put forward by Angela Friederici with respect to spoken language comprehension, the model basically says that there are 4 pathways, and it says there are 2 ventral pathways, slightly towards the bottom. So you can see here 4 particular pathways bottom. So one that basically is from superior temporal gyrus to primary auditory cortex to anterior superior temporal gyrus and further on, and there is a lower pathway that kind of starts from superior temporal sulcus to medial temporal gyrus and moves further to Brodmann's area 45. Now, these two ventral pathways basically are connecting the posterior part of the temporal lobes with the anterior parts of the temporal lobe and also the frontal operculum. We will see the frontal operculum is somewhere in the blue here. Okay. These ventral pathways, basically what they are doing is they are supposed to be involving the comprehension of meaning of words. So, broadly this is the area that kind of helps you understand meaning. Okay. And there are these two dorsal pathways. If you see on the top, starting from the green area, posterior temporal gyrus, Brodmann's area 44, and superior temporal sulcus to the premotor cortex. Okay. So, these two dorsal pathways on the top basically are connecting the posterior part of the temporal lobes to the frontal lobes. Now, these two pathways basically, so one of these basically which connects to the motor cortex, the one on the top, that is STS to IPC and PMC, that pathway basically is involved in the preparation of speech utterance. So, if you are hearing something and you want to speak something back or repeat it, that thing. Then the other dorsal pathway, basically the other dorsal pathway that starts from superior temporal gyrus to Brodmann's area 44, it connects and basically has connections with the STS and STG as well, is basically supposed to be involved with aspects of syntactic processing. So, now you see there are these two ventral pathways and two dorsal pathways. Among these four pathways, basically we are getting the comprehension part, we are getting the motor preparation part, and you are also getting the syntactic processing part. So, this, according to Angela Friederici, is also a model of spoken language comprehension. Now, let us move slightly further ahead and look into speech comprehension in some more detail. Now, we have seen that, say for example, speech production starts with a concept of pre-verbal thought. So, basically this is a neural model of speech production. Now, as we have seen speech production, we have seen in Levelt's model, we have seen Gary Dell's models as well. So, the idea is that if you have to speak something, it has to start from a place where there are no words. It starts from a zone where there is pre-verbal thought, and you start basically with that, and then that pre-verbal thought has to be assigned words. So, it will kind of from there, and then assign structure, you do morphological phonological encoding, you create the phonetic and gestural score, and then you finally articulate it. Okay. So, a number of models, as you know, have been proposed about speech production, and one of the most important models is Levelt's model of speech production, that is the Weaver++. One of the things that we can see is that even prior to the conceptual message, there is so Levelt says that two kinds of planning needs to be done: micro planning and macro planning. Macro planning is the broad message that you want to deliver, and micro planning is how do you formulate that message into exact words and syntactical structure and deliver the message. So, just to make you sort of remember this, this is how the Weaver++ model of William Levelt looked like. You can see at the top there is the conceptual preparation stage. From the conceptual preparation stage, you basically try and search whether my ideas have words in my language. So, that is the point where you kind of are looking for lexical concepts. You might have one or many lexical concepts that might be able to convey your idea. So, then you have to do lexical selection. You select a particular word. Once you selected a particular word, you kind of activate the lemma associated with it. If you remember, Levelt meant lemma to have both syntactic and semantic information. Once you have the lemma and you finalize basically that, okay, this is the word form that I have to say for example, if I were to talk about speaking or playing or sleeping, or I have to talk about the past tense of these verb forms, any of this, all of that will be specified in the lemma. And from the lemma then, because you sort of have an idea, you will do morphological encoding. Okay. So, activate the verb form speak, activate the suffix ing. So, that part. Once you have the morphological encoding started, you will activate the exact morpheme speak and ing. Then you go to in the phonological encoding part, starting to activate the basic sounds that make each of these morphemes. Once you are kind of activating the sounds, you realize that it has to be put in a syllable like structure. So, you do the syllabification, putting the slots together and so on, and then basically you move into finally creating the phonological word. Once you've syllabified the message, everything is sort of ready. You put that into a phonological word form. Okay, this is how something will be uttered. And once you have that, then the final step that is there is to also add the nuances of phonetics. So you kind of also add how this particular phoneme has to be delivered. So is it hamburger or a hamster, and those kind of things are done in the phonetic encoding stage. Once you sort of done the phonetic encoding, then the gestural score is ready. You just have to implement that basically as a program that will make your articulators move in particular configurations to deliver the message. So this was the model. Let us now look at how is this model sort of specified in terms of the brain. Now this was one model, by the way. The other model was Gary Dell's interactive model of speech production. We kind of read a lot about this in the errors in the area where we are talking about speech errors. And interactive model, so one of the differentiating factors of this interactive model as compared to Levelt's model is that these models allowed feedback, and they allowed phonological activation. So feedback from the phonological activation part to the semantic and syntactic properties of the words, and that sort of kind of made it a lot of a to and fro system, and could in that sense explain a lot of errors, like say for example the lexical bias effect, and those are, and then those kind of things that kind of show that okay, these are the possible processes that are happening in speech production. Now also, if you move further, we did talk a little bit about picture naming and word naming. Now about the neural areas that might be involved in doing this. So activation has been observed in the inferior temporal regions of the mainly of the left hemisphere and in the left frontal operculum when picture naming is being done. Also of this, the activation in the left frontal operculum might be attributed to the phonological encoding part, and articulation of word basically is activating the posterior parts of the Broca's area, that is BA44. Also it kind of activates the bilaterally the motor cortex, the supplementary motor area, and the insula. So these are some of the areas that are involved basically in the production of speech. Now other studies also using different methods like PET and fMRI have also shown that the supplementary motor area, the opercular parts of the precentral gyrus, the posterior parts of the inferior frontal gyrus, the insula, and the mouth regions of the primary sensory cortex are also in, sort of activated along with the regions of the subcortical structures like basal ganglia, thalamus, and cerebellum. All of them are involved in the motor aspects of speech production, finally delivering speech. Say for example, which areas, if you might be asked, which areas implement the gestural score, these will be the areas that are kind of actually making all the muscles move and deliver the message. So I think this was all about neural basis of speech comprehension and speech production. We will talk about a different aspect of language and the neural basis thereof in the next lecture. Thank you.